let's go ahead and kick this off. I'm really excited to walk through this sort of measurement methodology with Dale Harrison. We've been going back and forth on it now for several weeks. It really, I think, factors itself well with like how businesses run. It takes more of a wider aperture outside of just marketing sourced, and also accounts for a lot of the costing that goes into actually creating revenue for the business. And I think all those things will hopefully come to light here as we go through this discussion. If you have been here for any of the previous discussions, you will probably know that we have normally run over an hour going through these. I would expect to do the same today, just based on how Dale and I have workshopped this, and even our dry run basically went an hour. So I can only imagine what the actual live conversation will be. So I do want to hand it over to Dale to kind of walk through some aspects here of this of the deck. We'll talk through it. Please bring your questions. I have a couple of my own questions overall, but this should what this really is about. What bringing this kind of brand measurement ROI calculation is about giving you guys a repeatable and defensible way to measure against your brand investments in the absence of having an MMM, or even being able to use things like multi-touch attribution, things that most businesses don't have can't make the business case for, or don't, or have too much technical debt to actually bring something like that on. So this will give you a repeatable methodology that should be very easy to defend to your finance team, because it's going to account for a lot of aspects that they think about as they think about the financial health of the business. And it's going to give you a chance to look at really how brand is supposed to work, which is something that should affect all aspects of the business, not just marketing source. And so that is exactly what this ROI calculation is going to bring into the fold. So Dale, go ahead and get started, and I'll jump in as things transpire.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions,
Yeah.
throw them out, and I'm not going to be looking at the chat or anything, so I'll rely on Matt or Stephanie to stop me, and we can dive into any questions. So, marketing ROI, um, everyone does it. So, so let's start with how ROI is typically calculated. These come from the Facebook, HubSpot, and Salesforce websites. And these should be fairly recognizable to most people. So Facebook says that it's your revenue minus your marketing cost divided by your marketing cost. And then ROAS is sales revenue divided by ad spend. HubSpot was essentially the same, revenue minus marketing cost. Salesforce, because they're a sales-oriented company, and they acknowledge that there's actually such things as sales teams, they have a little bit broader definition where they simply call it marketing value, although they never actually define what marketing value is, but they assure you that that's the number you should be using. And so there are some fundamental problems with these. So why is this wrong? So first and foremost, revenue is the wrong metric, because businesses run on gross margins. They don't run on revenue. And as a result, it's misaligning marketing spend with 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 the revenue recognition events, in the sense that, and there's two misalignments here. One misalignment is with the fact that only a small portion of that revenue actually gets recognized as value to the business, because the revenue doesn't come for free. You actually have to have made and sold something in order to get that revenue. And there's some cost in delivering the product, and there's definitely cost in acquiring the customer. Um, uh, the other thing is that it fails to capture the long duration impact of brand marketing. And we've seen this over the last 20 years, especially in B2B digital marketing, where you've seen this almost complete abandonment of brand marketing in favor of the more easy to measure short-term performance marketing. Um, uh, Maybe the bigger, more subtle issue is the fact that it can't be used to determine if our marketing is effective. That it really is a measure of how efficiently you're spending the budget, but it's not a measure of whether or not that budget spend is actually producing effective results for the business. Um, so, so marketing ROI is essentially an efficiency metric, which means that it's got a much narrower scope than how people tend to try to use it. Um, and again, the distinction here is efficiency is doing things right. So how well were the resources used relative to the outputs versus effectiveness is doing the right things. So the degree to which the things you're doing are achieving business objectives. Um, so I want to start with a little bit of a discussion on how even when you can calculate an ROI number, it can be misleading. Um, and this is the other problem with ROI is that it's often used to try to represent the value that marketing is bringing to the business, which is an effectiveness measure. And it's really, at best, an efficiency metric and often not even a very good metric for that. Um, so one of the examples I always use is this idea of what's the ROI of a factory building. Nobody calculates the ROI of a factory building. Um, uh, so why are factories housed in buildings to start with? The buildings cost money up front to build, and they keep costing you forever through maintenance cost. So why aren't all factories just built out in the open in the middle of a field? Because their ROI is negative. No matter how you calculate it, it's a negative value. And the answer is that the factory building is bringing value to the business through mechanisms other than generating revenue or directly generating revenue. Um, that factory building has value to the business and is worth investing in because it takes the contents of the building, the machine tools and the workers that are running the factory, and it makes them both more efficient and more effective. So the machine tools last longer because they're not out in the weather. They're not down as often for maintenance. So these reduce cost and increase output. The workforce is more productive. The factory doesn't have to shut down every time it rains. So these are all ways that the building that houses the factory is bringing value to the business, and why businesses are more than happy to pay money to build a building, even though it has negative ROI. And so ROI is not always an ideal measurement for certain types of activities and assets. And I think marketing is one of these. So in many ways, marketing is a lot more like the factory building. Sales is more like the factory. So marketing delivers value by being this nonlinear amplifier of other linear functions of the business. So if marketing didn't exist, several things would happen. One, the sales team would have to spend a significant fraction of their time basically doing cold prospecting to find leads, rather than spending all of their time focused on being able to take leads that are likely to buy and focus on trying to close those to revenue. So because of what marketing does, sales is going to close deals faster at a higher close rate and at a lower sales cost, um, than what would be happening if marketing didn't exist. And I've seen this often in companies where you'll have an early stage startup and they will basically not do any marketing for the first 2, maybe 3 years, and they focus entirely on being sales driven. So they'll hire that sales team, and what you see that sales team doing is often spending at least half of their time just trying to prospect, looking for someone who's likely to buy. Then they have to basically explain a company that no one's ever heard about before. And and the entire sales process tends to be very, very inefficient and very costly without marketing being there to lay the groundwork ahead of time in terms of awareness about the product and the company, the ability to build trust in the product and the brand, and the ability to be able to identify and capture those leads so that sales can do the thing that really brings value from a sales standpoint, which is closing deals. So where are kind of best and worst cases for marketing ROI? And if you go back to the early prehistory, the earliest use of marketing ROI tended to come out of what used to be called direct response marketing. So these were companies, this is pre-internet, so 30, 40, 50 years ago. There were companies that sold products by putting ads in the backs of magazines, and you would either mail something in or you would call an 800 number and uh, and be able to then buy the product either through mailing something in or through calling a phone number. And in those cases, there's no sales team. There's sort of no brand marketing typically. Everything that you're doing with marketing is directly, immediately resulting in a sale. And so a lot of that kind of old school direct response marketing looks a lot like digital marketing that is focused exclusively on performance marketing. Exclusively on things like paid search would be an example of something that would be equivalent to that. So this still works quite well if you're doing something very narrow like pure online direct to consumer marketing. That kind of that traditional whatever we spent this month on marketing applies to the revenue that came in, because the lag time between when we made the marketing expenditure and when the revenue hit tends to be a very, very short time window. Um, where it does not work well is for most of B2B. And part of the problem here is that we tend to have very long time lags and long purchase cycles. So, on certainly something like enterprise, B2B enterprise SaaS, the average purchase cycle is 5+ years between coming back in market to buy again. Um, for many, especially for larger companies, it can often be a decade or more. So once you've got that, say, CRM system installed, you're going to go years before you're going to ever come back into the market to look at potentially replacing it. And the other problem here is that a lot of these B2B products have a very long sales cycle. So not only is it a very long period between purchases, but once they are ready to purchase, the sales cycle happens over a very extended period of time. And uh, and then the other part is the very heavy involvement and cost of the sales team in closing the deal. Um, it's not atypical for the budget for the sales organization to be significantly larger than the budget for the marketing organization in B2B companies, uh, because a lot of resources have to be poured into closing those deals. And uh, and we need to be able to somehow account for all of this if we want to do an ROI measurement. So the first step here is, if you think about ROI, it's two parts: return and investment. So return on investment. So the first step here is we need a better version of return. Um, so the first thing to know is that the return in ROI is not revenue. Revenue does not come for free. Every dollar of revenue costs that business something to collect. And the business only gets to keep just the portion of that revenue that's left over after paying the cost associated with making, selling, and delivering the product. And even for something like a SaaS product, that cost of just delivering and provisioning one more unit of that product is far from zero. I mean, typically that number is in the 20 to 25% range, because you've got all of the onboarding, the provisioning, there's it's usually relatively labor intensive. Um, there's the initial support to get them up, to get the customer up and going. That's all a part of delivering the product. That you would not have paid those dollars out, if you had not sold that one extra unit to one extra customer. And and then there's all of the costs associated with running the business in general, beyond just delivering and selling the product. So let's give an example of why a revenue ROI is a really, really bad idea. So let's say we've got two campaigns and you're reporting your campaign ROIs out, and this is using kind of the traditional Meta HubSpot kind of definition. So all we know is that one campaign generated 250,000 in revenue, one 400,000. Each campaign cost 100,000. So we have 150% ROI and a 400% ROI. So which campaign was best for the business? Um, so if this is all you know, then you would say campaign B generated 150,000 more in revenue and has, almost 3 times higher marketing ROI. It looks like a no-brainer. But reality is you have no idea. This information tells you nothing about which of these campaigns was best for the business. And the reason why is let's look at what the campaigns are doing. So campaign A is the campaign is for the widget store. Campaign A is we have better widgets. Campaign B is 50% off sale. So if we come back and recalculate this, but based on gross margin, and we'll talk about exactly what gross margin is in a minute, but but as a rough estimate, gross margin is the amount of money that the company keeps out of the revenue for the next incremental sale. So if the underlying product has a 50% gross margin, then that 250,000 allows the company to book 125,000 in profits. The 400,000, if we sell it at half price, we're going to cut our margin in half. And so now that 400,000, the business only keeps 100,000. So you're actually selling a lot more stuff and putting less money in the bank. And when we recalculate based on a margin-based ROI instead of a revenue-based ROI, suddenly campaign A has a 25% ROI and campaign B is a complete wash, 0 return on investment. So not only is this massively wrong, but the final answer of which of the two campaigns is better completely reverses once you start looking at how many dollars the business actually gets to keep from the sale versus just looking at the revenue. So this is why you cannot use revenue as the baseline for an ROI calculation. So this takes us into how do we do a margin-based ROI? And the problem is what type of margin? It turns out that there are 10 or 12 different types of margins that will be familiar to people in finance. The two most commonly used and talked about is net margin and gross margin, but there are many, many other kinds of margins that finance is going to be aware of. So net margin is, at a very, very high level, how much income did the business make after they paid all their bills versus how much revenue they generated. So, in most businesses, that net margin is down and around 15%, 12, 15% is relatively small. Which means that they're spending, 80, 85, 90% of the revenue they bring in is spent on running the business, making the product, selling the product, delivering the product, and then all the overhead of running the business. But a more important number is what's called gross margin. And so this is essentially revenue minus COGS divided by revenue. So COGS is an acronym. It stands for cost of goods sold. And so this really encompasses everything that a business has to spend to be able to deliver one more unit of product to a customer. So if you're manufacturing Toyotas, it's the cost of all of the parts that you had to buy and bring into the factory to assemble into a Toyota, all the labor it took to assemble those parts, and then all of the expenses that you incur in getting that car from the factory to the showroom and into the hands of a buyer. So it's all of the things associated with making and delivering the product to a paying customer. Um, uh, so there's another type of margin, and this is the one we're going to focus on. It's called contribution margin. So contribution margin is gross margin minus the cost of selling the product. So we have essentially two costs here. We have it costs us something to produce one more unit of the product and get it delivered. but then it also costs us something to get that customer to, to be able to close that customer that we're going to deliver the product to. And and so these are both real costs that come off of revenue. So and that cost of acquiring a customer is essentially the cost of the marketing plus the cost of the sales. Um, and so, what's left over after this, um, so this is essentially, so contribution margin is essentially what's left over after making the product and getting the product sold. And these are real costs that businesses have to write checks for and send out the door, and they only get to keep what's left over. So the important thing about contribution margin is that it's what's called the marginal cost of delivering the next unit of sale, meaning um, we're not looking at what did it cost to build the factory. We're not looking at what did it cost to, how much did we spend on the development team to produce the SaaS product. So these are sort of historical sunk costs that we're trying, ultimately we need to recover those costs as a business. But the first step in recovering those costs is to make sure that we sell it for more than the direct cost of making it and selling it. If we're going to sell it for $100, we need to make sure that it costs something less than $100 to both make it and to sell it and deliver it to the customer. And so even businesses that are, say, early stage, fast growing businesses that are losing money, where they're relying on, say, outside venture capital investment to be able to cover their expenses, there's still the expectation that contribution margin will be positive. And you see this, for instance, with Amazon and their history. So Amazon did not start booking profits for almost 20 years. And they spent that time basically making a lot of money off of every individual unit they sold. So their contribution margin was very positive on each individual item sold through Amazon. But they were taking those profits and pouring it back into building more warehouses, buying more inventory, and buying more trucks and airplanes to deliver it. And so, they were basically financing their capital expansion over their first 20 years because they had really strong contribution margin for each individual item sold. And so that's typically what you see in businesses is that you focus on not revenue, not net margin, which can both be, net margin can be way negative. What you focus on is contribution margin. So now if we go a little bit deeper, contribution margin is still not marketing's return. It's not what marketing is delivering to the business. Marketing is only delivering a part of that. So some fraction of that revenue would still have come in even if marketing did nothing, even if marketing didn't exist. And again, you often see early stage startups that will invest in a sales team well ahead of bringing in a marketing team. And in those companies, they were still making money, maybe not very efficiently, but they were still bringing in revenue long before the first salesperson was ever hired. And so sales is directly producing some fraction of that revenue, but then there's some additional fraction of revenue that exists solely because marketing is in place and doing their job. The other thing that's important here is this is not about marketing sourced revenue. Marketing sourced revenue is a very bad idea. And the reason why is that just because marketing solely sourced that lead doesn't mean that lead instantly materialized into a pile of cash. That lead still has to go through a lengthy and expensive sales process. And so when marketing does their presentation to the board or to finance, and they say, we had X number of dollars of marketing source revenue. When they leave the room and the salespeople come in and do their presentation, the salespeople will say, that's BS because every one of those deals, we sold it. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and that's a convincing argument that not only completely undermines the whole concept of marketing source revenue, but undermines the entire credibility of the marketing team. And uh, because the reality is that in a sales-based organization, again, if you're not a direct-to-consumer, fast fashion e-commerce site, if you're in something like a typical B2B enterprise SaaS company, um, every single dollar of revenue flowed through the hands of a salesperson. And that salesperson typically put in weeks or months of expensive effort that the company is acutely aware of having paid for before that revenue materialized. And so there's really no concept of marketing sourced revenue, um, other than as a mechanism to kind of destroy your credibility with with finance and senior leadership in the company. Um, so how do we actually get at this contribution margin? Um, and there's a couple of ways of doing it. And what I want to talk about is kind of the simpler of the two ways. So here, you really kind of just need four numbers. You need your total revenue, what your COGS are. So, what were the direct cost to make and deliver the product? For a SaaS company, this is not going to be the cost of this development team, but it's going to be related to things like server and bandwidth cost. Um, a lot of the costs are going to be related to provisioning and early stage onboarding and support. So these are all part of what it takes to deliver that type of product. If you're a manufacturer, it will be what's the cost of the materials and labor to produce, one more unit of product, and then what's it cost to put that on a truck and get it delivered to an actual customer. Um, but um, but there will be some sort of a COGS figure. For manufacturing, that COGS can often be 40 to 60% of revenue. For a SaaS company, it's can often be as little as 10 or 15% of the revenue, but it's not zero. And then what do the company spend on sales and what do the company spend on marketing? And so basically contribution margin is going to be the gross margin minus the cost to get the customer. So essentially, what did it cost us to make and deliver the product, and what did it cost us to get someone to deliver the product to? And so an example of this would be um, if we made 40 million in gross revenue for the quarter, we had 10 million in COGS. Sales, we spent 10 million for sales cost and 5 million for marketing cost. So at a very high level, that contribution margin is going to be the 40 million in revenue minus the 10 million minus the 10 million from sales cost minus the 5 million. So that 40 million in revenue is going to become 15 million. And this is why the traditional way of calculating marketing ROI massively grossly overstates what the ROI is. Because you're reporting ROI against 40 million, but the company only gets to keep 15 of that. And the deal is that they know, people in finance know this. They're not being fooled. They know that these ROI numbers that marketing is reporting are completely fantasy numbers. Um, so um, let's see. There was a question about so where's the cost of the dev team?
Yeah, where's dev team fall?
So
Dev falls under COGS in a sense, does it not?
no, no.
Oh, it's
So
labor.
so typically, here's an easier way to visualize how you account for the dev team. The dev team for a software product is equivalent to the factory for a physical product. Um, because they're the ones that, the dev team is the ones that are actually making the exact thing that gets delivered to a customer and used. In the same way that a factory is making the widgets that are, they're taking parts in the door, they're adding labor to it, and then they're using their machine tools to then, fabricate these parts into a final product that gets delivered to the customer. So the factory is considered a capital expense. So whatever it costs you to build that factory um, is a long-term fixed sunk investment. So typically you've already spent the money on the factory before the first unit comes off the floor. In the same way that you've already spent huge amounts of money on that development team before the first usable version of the product is ever able to be logged into. Um, so typically what you do is you want to separate, from an accounting standpoint, you separate out these kind of long-term sunk costs um, that that uh, that you had to make an investment in order to have something to sell. Separate that out from your short-term variable cost. So, if you didn't make that investment to create the product, you would have nothing to sell. But once you've made that investment, then there's going to be some cost to actually deliver it to the customer and to actually acquire the customer through sales and marketing. And so, um, uh, so basically that investment in software development or that investment in building a factory is a capex that then gets either amortized or depreciated over a period of time. So in other words, uh, you know, at some level in the accounting, they are applying some cost, some prior expense toward building the product to every individual product that goes out the door. Um, but from our standpoint, in terms of because marketing and sales are purely operating expenses, they're not capital expenses, and so that's why we can focus just on contribution margin. What's that incremental cost of getting one more unit of the product delivered to a paying customer. And so, um, um, anyway, so this is why it's treated a bit differently. The other thing is there's also a lot of additional overhead. So there are other operating expenses, OPEXs, that the business incurs that are sort of spread out across everything. That's a less, that would not be part of contribution margin. So for instance, the finance team, the accounting team, HR, the facilities, the office that you're in and what it costs to pay the rent on the office. These are all overhead expenses that are assumed to be kind of fixed expenses for the business as a whole. And you're allocating portions of those expenses to each new, each new unit of sales revenue. But it's not, these are not expenses that would go up or down if you sold more or less. And so the kind of the key question is, if we suddenly sold nothing this month, um, what would our expenses be? If we sold twice as much this month, how would our expenses change? So if we, let go of the sales team, let go of the marketing team, just went to zero activity on all of those, um, um, obviously revenue would go down, but the, um, you know, but, but, y- but these aspects of expenses for the business are considered variable costs, meaning that they're going to go up and down as revenue goes up and down in a way that the size of HR, for instance, isn't going to go up or down each month based on whether or not revenue went up or down. Long term, as the business grows, HR will grow with the, essentially relative to the size of the business as a whole, but it doesn't fluctuate up and down from month to month. So we talked about the R side of ROI, but we also need to look at a more complicated part, which is the I side, the investment. So I is the marketing cost. So one of the things that we have some advantages with in looking at revenue and contribution margin is that revenue tends to be fixed to specific points in time. So, when the sales team closes a deal, we know exactly, when that revenue event occurred. And we know exactly how much it is at that point. Um, so revenue is easy to measure and contribution margin is easy to estimate. But marketing costs tend to be spread out over time, and that makes it a lot harder to connect specific marketing costs to specific revenue. And again, the thing that has been done with sort of the incorrect approach to um, calculating marketing ROI is to look at current period revenue divided by current period marketing cost. But the fact is that little or none of that marketing cost in that given month or quarter actually had anything to do with the revenue that came in that month or quarter. Um, and a specific example here is that if marketing is delivering a stream of leads to sales, but sales has a, say, a 90-day close cycle, so 90-day average sales cycle, then even if that next lead ends up closing and becoming a customer, there'll be no revenue recognition event for another quarter because there's a time lag there between when marketing has done its job and when sales finishes its job and actually produces revenue. And so the revenue doesn't come instantaneously. And so if you're in a business that's running, say, a 1 quarter average sales cycle, which is not atypical at all within B2B SaaS, if you're running a 1 quarter sales cycle, that means that no marketing expenses this quarter had any influence on this quarter's revenue. That it will have major influence on next quarter's revenue, but not this quarter's. And the reality is that once that prospect enters the sales process, marketing has very, very little influence over either the rate at which how quickly the deal will close or how likely the deal will close. Most of those things are either already locked in or they are outside the control of anything that marketing can do. So marketing has little or no contribution once a prospect is in the sales process. Their contribution is what happens during the period of time up to when that prospect enters the sales process. Which I realize goes counter against a lot of kind of folklore within B2B marketing, but there are really good studies that show that whether you're doing no marketing or a lot of marketing in terms of kind of sales support marketing, um, deals close at exactly the same rate. Doesn't matter. And the reason why is that almost all of that, if it takes 90 days for sales to close a deal, it doesn't mean that they need 90 days worth of constant convincing to talk them into it. Oftentimes they're talked into it, by the second or third day. And the rest of that time is, how long does it take for procurement to process the paperwork? How long does it take for accounting? I mean, for legal to review the contract? How long does it take accounting to set up a vendor record so that they can accept an invoice or a PO? And there's no email campaign you're going to run that will make legal review that contract, 1 day sooner. There's no email campaign you're going to run that's going to make procurement, get off their rear ends and process that paperwork 1 day sooner. And that's the bulk of why things take a long time to close, is there is a lot of internal machinery that has to go on within the customer that neither sales nor marketing have any control over. And likewise, the highest predictor of whether or not you're going to win a deal is whether or not you are in the day one consideration set, which is driven entirely by whether or not the buyer was aware of the brand well ahead of when they came in market to buy. And so, so about 75% of what determines whether or not a particular product gets selected for final purchase is entirely determined by whether or not there had been good brand marketing done and the buyers, the key buyers were aware of the product and the brand before they had a need. So again, marketing has very, very little to offer to influence things once the sales process has started. Therefore, if we're trying to calculate an ROI, what we really have to look at isn't any marketing expenses during the time that the sales cycle is underway. You have to look at what marketing did before the sales process begins. And we'll look at that in a second. So Uh, so I want to talk about kind of categories of expenses. So we have performance marketing, and then how to think about these in terms of figuring out how to allocate these historical marketing expenses to current period revenue. So performance marketing is basically focused on generating leads that sales will close over the next average sales cycle. It acts on the 5% who are currently in market, and it generally does a very, very poor to non-existent job of producing any kind of durable brand association for the 95% who are not in market. So, um, uh, so any of the sort of lead gen performance marketing kind of activities are inherently very, very short term, and they will either produce a result or not produce a result within one sales cycle, and they'll have no lasting effect after that. Brand marketing will also produce immediate results. So this is one of the great misunderstandings in B2B marketing. Brand does not take a long time to produce a result. Brand marketing will produce a result instantaneously, but it will only work on people who are already in that 5% who are in market. And to give you a specific example, I have run billboard campaigns for extremely niche B2B products. Specifically, these were research products sold to scientists doing biomedical research. We would put billboards up at the traffic choke points leading into a major medical or academic research center. Literally, the hour the billboard goes up, we could immediately start to see impact in terms of brand aware search, and in terms of the performance of our um, uh, paid search campaigns, and the performance of our placements in category generic search. And we could immediately start to see traffic to the website coming directly result of that billboard. And that billboard is, you do not get more classic brand marketing than a billboard. The other thing that we would see, though, and this is the thing with brand marketing, is that there's also a long-term effect. Because it's designed to form a durable brand memory association, these memories can influence the 95% as they come in market over future time periods. So we would run these billboards for like a month. At the end of that month, we would still see this heightened effect. We would see a greater than normal rate of things like brand aware search for up to 90 days after the billboard went down. Now, again, it would gradually decline because people would forget about us. But over that next 2-3 months, even after the billboard is down, there's still enough people that saw the billboard, saw it enough times that they remembered it. They've not yet forgotten it, and they will continue to be influenced by that piece of marketing long after the marketing goes away. So this is the real power of brand marketing, is that it gives you this, the performance marketing works very short term. Brand marketing also works short term, but brand marketing keeps working off into the future, but at a diminishing rate as these memories are progressively forgotten. And then the last thing is this idea of latency to revenue. So revenue is not instant. There is some average sales cycle. So once a prospect enters that sales cycle, marketing's got little or no ongoing influence. So, if you've got a 90-day sales cycle, this implies that no marketing expenses this quarter influenced any current quarter close one deals and the associated revenue. So we have to be able to do these time shifts if we want to figure out how to line up the marketing expenses from the past with the current period revenue. A final note here. So average sales cycle is really critical to doing these sorts of ROI calculations. So best practice is to generally aggregate marketing expenses in time blocks that match average sales cycle. So, if the average sales cycle is 90 days, then aggregate the marketing expenses by quarter and recalculate the ROI on a quarterly basis. If you've got a fast sales cycle, say a 30-day sales cycle, then do everything on a month-by-month basis. And generally, if you've got a very long sales cycle, nothing much is changing fast in the business. So you don't really need to recalculate an ROI number every day or every week or every month. Um, and so, the idea here is to look to the sell cycle as kind of the way to chunk up time, chunk up your expenses, um, uh, on the marketing side, in blocks that match the sell cycle length. So applying the model. So we're getting closer to an actual number here. So what I want to talk about is a, a, a concept, kind of visualize what I had just talked about the fact that these brand campaigns work immediately, but then they continue to have an influence off in the future. So this is looking from the standpoint of, we did some marketing this quarter, or this month, whatever time period. So we did some brand marketing, we did some performance marketing. So the performance marketing will entirely have an effect, yet, good or bad, positive or negative. Its effect is gonna be completely will completely occur within one sell cycle, because its focus is identifying people who are in market and activating them into the sales process. And at some point they're going to reach a close one or close loss, and then they're not going to be in the market for typically a long time to come. The brand campaign will do exactly the same thing, but only for people who are in that 5%. But because there are future buyers that see that campaign, that will come in market next quarter and the quarter after and the quarter after, that this quarter's brand campaign will continue to have positive influence on future sales cycles, but at a lower and lower level, because what's happening is people are rapidly, progressively forgetting that they saw the brand campaign. Now, again, if we're running the same brand campaign every single quarter, then we're refreshing these memories, and you get a somewhat different effect. But what I'm looking at is kind of what's the diminishing influence on future cell cycles for what we do during this cell cycle. Um, so performance campaign. So a sales lead today won't become revenue for one cell cycle in the future. So, and just to make the conversation easier, let's just assume for now we're talking about a 90-day sell cycle, but you have to adjust this for um um if your business's sell cycle is different. Um, so the revenue that closed this quarter was a result of marketing leads delivered last quarter. That means that we need to match this quarter's revenue against last quarter's performance marketing expense. On the brand campaigns, the question here is, how fast are people forgetting? And this is a very hard number to measure, but there are reasonably good estimates out there. And because there have been some very good studies going back decades now, looking at how fast people forget, how fast these brand memories are forgotten across a population. So for high consideration goods, which most sort of expensive B2B products fall into this, a reasonable estimate is that about 50% of the people exposed to a B2B brand ad will have forgotten it within 90 days. So there'll be no active recall. Um, and but what that means also is that 50% forget it in the next 90 days. Of that 50% of those will forget it in the next 90-day period on down. So it's like a radioactive decay, except it's memories. And so this gives us an estimate of decay rate that's a reasonable estimate to use. And again, part of what we're trying to get at here is a reasonable, defensible marketing ROI estimate, not necessarily an exact number. And so, if you don't like the 50% in 90 days, you can replace it with another number if you have better data. Most people don't have better data. This usually requires pretty extensive market research to be able to precisely measure that for your product. But, again, for high consideration B2B goods, it might be 12 weeks, it might be 10 weeks, it might be 8 weeks, but none of that's going to make that much of a difference in the final calculation. So what we need to do, though, is we need to allocate this period's brand campaign expenditures across future sales cycles. And let's just do a really quick look at this idea of decay. So if we're losing 50% of of memory, with every quarter, then the idea is that this quarter's brand expense could be allocated um, in terms of half of the cost going to the current quarter, 25% going to the next quarter, 15% to the next quarter, 10%. These are rough estimates of what a 50% per quarter decay rate would look like. It's technically 50, 25, 12.5, 6.25, but again, this lets us just sort of round it up to easy numbers. Um, and this is what this looks like. So if we look at, if we implanted, uh, you know, recallable, durable brand memories in 10,000 people's heads, within 1 month, 22% will have forgotten. Within 2 months, another 17 and a half, 3 months, another 14%. So you get this kind of decay curve over time. And this is what we're trying to take into account in terms of how prior expenditures for brand marketing are still having a lingering influence on people that are currently in an active sales process this period. So let's pull the pieces together here. So to do a marketing ROI estimate, we need a few pieces here. So we need some estimate of incremental contribution margin instead of revenue. We need to factor in the latency effects, the fact that sales takes time. We need to factor in the lag effects of brand marketing's influence, how it will continue to have influence off into the future. Or inversely, how historical investments in brand marketing are continuing, to have lagging influence into the current business cycle. Um, and then we need to align the average sales cycle as the baseline period and to focus on calculating an overall marketing ROI. And one of the things I want to talk about as well, just briefly, is this idea of there's a lot of different marketing ROIs. There is what is the total marketing ROI for everything marketing is doing. But then there's also what's the ROI on this campaign, or what's the ROI for, we're doing connected TV. So what's the ROI on CTV? And then the other thing that people attempt to do, which is just a bad idea, is what was the ROI on this one deal? And the problem is that it is impossible to know all of the influences that are associated with, a particular customer or even a particular channel or a particular campaign. And one of the things that is, has been, a massive influence from Refine Labs is to popularize this idea of dark social, the idea that there are a lot of influences that are going, that are pushing customers toward your brand or toward a competitor's brand that are completely invisible. They're outside your ability to even know that it exists, much less to be able to measure it. And so it becomes, it becomes essentially a complete impossibility to try to figure out the ROI of a deal or even the ROI of a channel or a campaign. You're much better off just trying to come up with a broad ROI that represents all of marketing's investments, in the company, and and then being able to defend that number, at a fairly detailed level. So, so we need two pieces here. We need to calculate an I and we need to calculate an R to get the ROI. So, so we need to start with some assumptions about average sales cycle, brand memory decay rates. And again, it's not hard to look at the CRM to get to see what a particular company's average sales cycle is. The memory decay rates, typically you're not going to have any information on that. In the absence of any information, 50% per quarter is a reasonable defensible estimate. It will never be, the decay rate might be faster than that. It will never be slower than that. This is basically the slowest that people will forget. but again, it's a reasonable number in the absence of a more specific measurement. And then you want to look at period by period marketing expenditures broken out by into three categories: performance campaigns, brand campaigns, and then admin and overhead, because a big chunk of marketing has nothing to do with campaigns. It's all the MarTech cost, all of the data analytics, all of the management overhead. So there's lots of other costs other than what did it cost us to produce this brand campaign or this performance campaign. So this is what real numbers would look like. So what we're looking at here is the current sales cycle. And I just marked this as Q, and then we're going to pick up expenses off into the past between performance and brand. So this is Q minus one. So 1 quarter in the past, 2 quarters in the past, 3 quarters in the past, 4 quarters in the past. So the idea is 100% of the performance campaigns we're going to allocate against, from Q minus one, we're going to allocate to the current quarter's revenue. We'll allocate all of marketing's admin and overhead to the current quarter. On the brand, we'll allocate half of what we spent on brand this quarter to, or last quarter, to the current quarter's revenue. But then we'll pick up 25% of what we'd spent one quarter previously, add that in, 15% of what we spent 2 quarters or 3 quarters previously, 10% from 4 quarters previously, and we basically add up the pieces. So here what we assume is, $100,000 a quarter total marketing cost. 50,000 are spent on performance campaigns, 40,000 on brand, and then another 10,000 in overhead. And then we've got these base assumptions of a 90-day sales cycle and a memory decay rate of 50% per quarter. So there's really no hard math here. And most of these numbers, either marketing already has it or marketing can go to finance and finance can help get it for them. So, what we're doing is we're picking up, bits and pieces over different time periods, adding them up to allocate them against the revenue that's generated from within the current sales cycle. So a couple of notes on this. So this example assumes a 90-day average sales cycle, which also assumes that you're calculating the ROI on a quarterly basis. And then all of the categories of marketing expenses are basically aggregated on a quarter by quarter basis. So the final allocation of marketing cost is simply equal to the total. In this particular example, this final allocation is simply equal to the total quarterly marketing cost. So here we're assuming 100,000 per quarter in total marketing costs, and we're adding all these pieces up that gives us back 100. So the question is, why don't we just do it the old-fashioned way and say current period marketing cost 100 divided by current period revenue or contribution margin? And the reason why is that this example, just for simplicity, assumes that you're spending exactly the same amount quarter by quarter forever. So in other words, the last 5 years, you've been spending 40,000 on brand every single quarter and 50,000 exactly every quarter on performance. The reality is campaigns come and go and expenditures vary over time periods. And that's why you have to look at what the actual expenses were. So if you have a business that never changes, where you're always spending exactly the same amount for brand and performance every single quarter forever, one, that's not a very interesting business. It's not going to be growing. But in those cases, you're going to have a lot simpler final allocation amount for marketing, for the marketing investment. But real businesses, these numbers, these baseline numbers, so this 25% allocation from 2 quarters ago, is going to be 25% of a different base than the 50% of the brand expenditures from last quarter that we're using. So you have to understand that you really need to look at these allocations against the actual numbers quarter by quarter to be able to get an estimate of what those investments were. So the final part here, we're getting close, is we then need to calculate the R in the ROI. And so here we basically need to understand what the revenue and the gross margin rates are, the sales costs, because 100% of the sales costs are going to apply to current period revenue, and then whatever allocated marketing costs. There's an alternate and more precise way of doing this where you measure the rate of incremental sales contribution versus incremental marketing contribution. But these generally require some sort of a fairly good MMM study. Most businesses don't have that. So, the good enough mechanism is just look at how much the business, how much the company's spending on sales each period, and then, come up with this allocated set of marketing costs based on this sort of an analysis, to figure out, how much of the historical marketing cost have an influence this particular sales cycle. So what does this look like? So here, if we had gross accrued revenue, and this is one additional term here. So when that sales team closes a deal, it may still be, especially if you're dealing with a large corporation, it could be 30, 90, 60, 180 days before, Exxon actually does a wire transfer to the company's bank account. And so it's not really how much revenue was collected, but how much revenue was accrued. And so what accounting does is they will say, we know it's coming. It may take 6 months before we get Exxon to finally pay us, but we know it's coming. So we're going to accrue those closed won deals to the current period's accrued revenue, and then we'll adjust this when the actual dollars come in. So if you're having this conversation with finance, it's important to understand that what you're looking for isn't the cash flow this quarter, but the accrued revenue this quarter. So, and let's say the gross margin rate is 85%. So this is not out of alignment for a SaaS company. So that means that of this million, we get to keep 850,000 before sales and marketing cost. But then, let's say sales costs were 250,000, and then our calculated marketing allocation, looking at these historical values, comes in at 100. So this gives us a contribution margin of 500,000 out of the million. So basically it says, once the company was able to deliver the product, and pay for acquiring that customer, of that million, 500,000 is left. And then we apply that against the allocated marketing cost, and this would give us a 5x ROI. So how is this different than the usual marketing ROI calculations? So one is contribution margin is used instead of revenue. And this is, no matter what you do, you really need to shift to contribution margin if you want the numbers to have any sort of credibility. The mere fact that you walk into finance and say the word contribution margin out loud will massively increase your level of credibility. So the other thing is, you want to do a holistic calculation. So, sales doesn't come for free. So you need something that is factoring in the real cost of the business of running that sales organization, because, even when marketing delivers, an absolute guaranteed to close deal, it still has to go through the sales process, and that sales process is still not cheap. not free. And then the other thing is to recognize that there's a latency between when marketing does its thing and then later, once sales has done its thing and the revenue event occurs. Um, which means that marketing costs from these prior periods have to be systematically allocated to current period revenue and contribution margin. So, um, and the net effect of this is generally a much more believable, realistic number, but a much smaller number. So if we look at kind of the naive marketing ROI that you get from HubSpot or Salesforce and Meta, and this is a slightly different example, so I'm not showing all of the supporting data, but just give you an estimate of kind of some reasonable numbers from a real company. You know, the naive way of doing this, where it's like total revenue, and you're only applying the current period sales cost to it, you're coming at a 12x ROI, which is a gross overstatement. Once you switch to simply total contribution margin, um, not even taking into account those sales costs, this comes down to 9x. Once you come in with incremental contribution margin, it's going to drop by, another factor of more than 3. Um, and then when you start factoring in time lags, the ROI actually goes up slightly. And then there's one last thing that we haven't really talked about, is this idea of cross effects, meaning that your prior brand marketing will make your performance marketing more efficient and more effective. So you get more value per dollar spent with your performance marketing if you're marketing against people who are already familiar with the brand. Um, and uh, and that can make the ROI go up a bit higher. But even in the end, you end up with an ROI that is between a third and a fourth what you would get um, doing kind of the naive calculation. And again, people in finance know this. They may not know why 12x is wrong, but they know that there's something seriously wrong with 12x ROI, because they're looking at how the business is underperforming and they're looking at how much sales is missing their targets, you know, but supposedly marketing is blowing it out of the park. Meanwhile, sales is running at, they can't hit 50% of allocation. And so, um, these sort of grossly, absurdly inflated ROI numbers that get reported out of marketing, everybody knows that this is complete make believe numbers, even if they can't explain exactly why it's wrong. And so the idea of coming in with this kind of a structured approach, um, when reporting these kind of numbers, is that you can defend every single part of this number, um, and uh, uh, and so the idea is not necessarily to come up with an absolutely precise number, because I don't think that's possible, but to come up with a number that is reasonable, likely within the ballpark of reality, but a number that you can defend in detail in ways that will be acceptable by the CFO, the CEO, and the board. So, uh, and then one last thing about marketing ROI versus campaign ROI is that campaign ROI is extremely hard to estimate reliably. These ROAS numbers you get from Google and Facebook are complete bullshit. Um, and again, are intentionally maxed way, way above anything related to reality. Because again, it's in their interest to convince you to pour all your money into more Facebook ads and, quit sending any of that money to Google. So everybody is going to grossly over report, the ROI and ROAS numbers. Um, um, and then the other thing is that the problem with campaign versus overall market ROI is that buyers are influenced by multiple exposures, most of which we cannot see or track. So it's generally better to focus on overall marketing ROI. Don't try to come up with individual, campaign level or deal level ROIs. And then be able to present these numbers with, with much more credibility and in a way that's fully defensible within the language of finance and business.
All right. Well, I'll let you cook that entire time. So I just decided to not jump in on that at all in any color, but that was fantastic. I really appreciate you walking through that. There were a couple of questions. I'm not sure. I'll go through them in a second. I did want to ask like a one quick question because I think this is fairly obvious, but we'll bring it up anyway because we were talking about it before we even went live when you and I were running through this about a couple hours ago. I was like, if you're venture backed and you're basically spending more money to acquire customers than you're probably earning, you're going to probably have in some instances like a negative marketing ROI in some cases. And like, I guess, that's not something that would be uncommon, I suppose, in a venture backed company that's spending a lot of money to acquire a customer. Yes.
So ideally, the answer would be no.
Sure. I mean,
And
ideally, but
yeah,
that's not how it works with how sales and marketing costs usually are
so,
loaded into those
right.
forms.
So so one of the things with something like SaaS is that your underlying gross margins are very high in SaaS because the cost of delivering one more unit of software online is quite low. Um, which means that the bulk of your cost for delivering one more unit of the product is primarily the sales and marketing cost. And you see this, with things like CAC payback time. If your CAC payback time is 5 years, um, and this would be a fully integrated CAC that's not just marketing CAC, but what is that cost of acquiring the customer from both the sales and the marketing side? If it's a 5-year payback on a SaaS product, but your average churn rate is 3 years, you are not going to be a surviving business, period. Not only are you not going to be a surviving business, no one's going to want to buy you, because the way a business survives or even gets bought is by having positive contribution margin, meaning, yeah, it may be very expensive to run the business and very expensive to run that software development team, but for every individual unit we sell, we're making a solid profit on it. And so again, a clean example of this is to look at the history of Amazon, where Amazon was making from day one, they're making a very good profit off of every item that they sell and ship. But they go 20 years without booking a profit because they're taking all of that uh, all of that gross margin from those individual sales and pouring it back into capital investment.
Right.
Um, so if a SaaS business is going to get, say, bought, which is probably the more common exit these days, and and I went through a part of my career working in finance and specifically working in mergers and acquisitions. So I did valuation analysis for acquisition targets. And one of the things that we looked at was, is there a positive contribution margin, for each item being sold? Because the company might be losing money, but what we're going to do is we're going to wipe out all of the overhead. So we're going to wipe out HR, finance, accounting, warehouse, facilities, all of that. We may even wipe out their manufacturing, if we can manufacture the product on our own production line and be able to soak up excess production capacity that we've already got. And so, but as long as we know that we're going to make a profit, you know, a a a positive contribution margin on each additional sale, then we can buy this profit, this company who's never made a profit and still be able to make this a profitable acquisition because we just get rid of all the overhead. Um, the problem is if you look at a company and you say, even when we get rid of all the overhead and all we're down to is just what it costs to make, deliver, and sell the product, and they're still losing money, there's like nothing we can, there's no way to make this a good deal. And I think you're going to see this over the next, few years now that we're in kind of the uh the the post, zero interest rate policy era, and the post kind of grow at all cost era, um, in VC investments. Is I think you're going to see a lot of these VC backed companies will end up simply not even being sold, just being shut down, because there's no way that, you know Adobe could come in and buy you, or Oracle could come in and buy you and
Mhm.
ever make you profitable.
Right. What you're seeing now is a lot of these companies just merge
Yeah.
essentially, which is probably going to come with, a lot of layoffs on the back end of that as well.
Well,
Oh, go
I was
ahead.
gonna say there's some weird accounting stuff that makes those mergers make sense,
Mhm.
where you can actually take two losing companies that are never going to make it and merge them, and at least on from an accounting standpoint, make it look good through what's called goodwill, where you can basically turn those past losses into an asset on the balance sheet. It's some very, very weird, funky accounting, but just because you see two companies merge doesn't mean that this is anything other than a desperation move ahead of eventually going under.
Sure.
But
One
you
of
got to have that positive contribution margin. You got to be able to make and sell it for less. I mean, you got to be able to sell it for more than it costs you to make and deliver and sell the product.
Yeah. One other thing we talked about when we were talking about the calculation of this ROI was how expansion revenue fit into this. And we do normally, you include this in this ROI calculation. And the primary reason when we talked about it was that a lot of the times the bulk of your expansion revenue happens within the first, 1 to 1.5 years of actually getting the
Yeah.
customer, right? Because like a lot of these things happen through pilots, so you can prove the product, the value of the product, and then the implementation comes in, and then you end up expanding it, which speaks a little bit to what you and I were talking about earlier around the idea of the bow tie model and revenue architecture. But yes, we do
Yeah.
include expansion revenue in this calculation.
Right.
Yeah.
And the reason why is it's generally not going to be a a large enough fraction of total revenue to
Right.
to really move the needle, because again, we're not trying to get a precise ROI number out to five decimal places here.
Mhm.
We're trying to get something that's plus or minus 50%. We're
Yeah.
trying to get something that's in the ballpark. Um, because what we've been delivering is more like, you know, 5x or 10x too big a number. If we can get it down to a number that we can confidently say we're pretty sure the actual RO number is plus or minus 50% of this value we're reporting, that's a big error range, but it's still a lot closer than anything that's being delivered now. And it's going to be a much more credible conversation to have with senior leadership around what marketing is actually bringing to the table.
Right.
One other thing that I mentioned that I noticed in the comments that's worth mentioning is this idea of labor allocation. Certain parts of labor within a marketing budget is really kind of just overhead. But a lot of that labor is being applied to specific campaigns. So the question is this person doing creative development work? So are they creating the ads and the campaigns? Is this person doing media buying and media planning and media allocation? These all are just part of the cost of either the performance campaigns or the brand campaigns. Um, then you have, the people running the MarTech platforms, the people doing the analytics. That's pure overhead. This is not doing anything to bring a new customer in the door. This is a total dead waste of, not, I wouldn't say dead waste, but these are dead expenditures that are not, that are maybe making people feel fuzzy and warm inside the company, but they're not bringing one more customer in the door. And so all of, so marketing ops, martech, analytics and reporting, upper management and marketing, these are all overhead. None of these are going toward actually running a campaign that's going to bring a customer in the door. And so that's how you want to kind of think about allocating labor between, you know, is it, you know, would this campaign have not gone out the door if this labor had not been applied to producing and setting up and running that campaign? Or is this labor associated with things that are not directly associated with getting, any campaigns up and going?
Right.
But there's a lot of dead weight in all departments. It's not just marketing. You see the same thing in even in sales, which tends to be a pretty highly efficient organization in terms of labor utilization. But even in sales, there still is a certain fraction of that organization that never sees a customer, never talks to a customer, and never closes a deal.
Yep. So, one question, like, how often do you redo this sort of calculation? My guess is you do it every sales cycle, essentially, to sort of re-benchmark yourself. And then second question off the back end of that is, how do you let this influence your decision making in terms of like what activities to do? I mean, to have the number is good, to present it to leadership and for them to know it is good, assuming that they buy into it. But, with it, if you're the marketer, marketing leader, marketing subject matter expert looking at this and you see that number, how does it influence your own action?
Speaking from someone who's had senior leadership positions
Sure,
and
yeah. I mean,
who
I'm
who have
all,
who's
yeah.
had positions in finance, um, if you think about how finance is really operating, um, finance acts like a banker in a sense. You've got all of this cash coming in the door, and the question is, what do we do with the cash? So um, we could use the cash to write checks to our shareholders. So lots of companies do that. But but some portion of this cash has to be reinvested back in operations. And so one of the things you're doing as a CFO is you're saying, should I put more cash into sales versus marketing, more cash into, say, new feature development for out of the development team versus putting cash into HR? Um, and uh, and so in the end of the day, these kind of ROI values at at, you know at the level of organizational units are really are really there to help finance make cash allocation decisions. You know, if I took $10 from marketing and moved it over to sales, am I going to get more revenue or less revenue? And if I get more revenue, then I'm going to, if I move 10 more dollars over, do I still get more revenue? And so you're constantly balancing these investments across the organization. And so, uh, the ROI numbers are what they are.
Mm.
And, and if you deliver bogus numbers based on, what HubSpot tells you, those numbers are going to be ignored, and somebody in finance is going to come up with their own numbers for you instead. And chances are you're not going to like what those numbers look like because they're not going to have any of the nuance and any of sort of the understanding of how marketing works the way that we just talked about. And so, so even if the numbers aren't great, even if the numbers mean that, you're going to lose budget to sales or to development or something, um, if you don't deliver reasonable numbers, someone else is going to come up with numbers that are probably less reasonable. But someone is still going to make these decisions. You may not know about them. You may have no idea. The only thing you may know is that your budget got cut 25%
Mm.
and have no idea why. But and you see this in companies, you know, sales just got a 50% increase in budget and we only got a 15% increase. How come? The how come is people are looking, people in finance are looking at what's the best return I can get on relative investments across different organizational units within the company. And so you want to be at the table with the best possible number that is sufficiently believable that they'll use your number versus something that they come up with on their own.
Sure.
I mean, it's sort of a brutal explanation, but it's the reality of what happens behind closed doors.
Yeah. So there's another question actually that got asked that I thought was super interesting, which was about kind of making this, or can you make this kind of ROI calculation almost forward-looking to help forecast, and like how you put kind of brand budget allocation into a forecasting exercise like this to predict what you or forecast what you think you may get out of an increase in brand investment or performance marketing investment or the like.
Yeah, I think you
And
can.
that feels like almost its own kind of event to
Yeah.
do. But
But
like I'll let you give the short answer before we break.
I mean, when done properly, that's called MMM.
Sure.
I mean, that's the reality. Is that's essentially what you're trying to come up with out of an MMM model. And technically, that MMM model is trying to get more precise numbers for how different categories of spend impacted revenue historically. And,
Mm,
and then you can take that model and say, if things don't change or if things continue to change, at the pace that they've changed in the past. In other words, if we're growing, 10% per quarter and we've been growing 10% per quarter for 5 years, then we can assume that we'll continue to grow at 10% per quarter. And therefore we can make some estimates as to uh, what the future could look like differently if we altered our investments in, say, brand versus performance versus buying more MarTech that's not going to bring any new customers in the door. Um, and but usually you need more information than what you can get from an ROI calculation to come up with that.
yeah.
Um, uh, and one of the things that gets tricky here is that um, as you put more and more money, say, into a particular channel, so a lot of MMM is really looking at channel level performance. As you put more and more money into, say, LinkedIn ads, you're going to reach a saturation point to where you put twice as many dollars into LinkedIn and you're going to get 1% more response out. So you've got these S curves where once you roll over the top of that S curve, you just quit getting you quit getting good performance out of the additional spend. Which means you need to then shift and reallocate that budget to a different channel. And
Mm,
that's a lot of what MMM will help you do, is to map where you are on those S curves, how likely it is that adding uh you know X% more dollars to a given channel is going to result in Y% more response, meaning Y% more leads, more sales qualified leads, more revenue, depending on how you're doing the MMM models.
right. All right. We went an hour and a half. That was fantastic, Dale. Appreciate you going through that. Uh, and hopefully all of you got some value out of that as well. I certainly did. It's been really fun to work with you on this series overall, and go and kind of go over how to do this. A lot of these things are, been around actually for quite a while. It just feels like a foreign concept, I think, for some in B2B tech, where it's a little bit more of the zeitgeist out there for how to measure marketing. We will make sure that this deck gets to you all via email. We will surely put this on our YouTube channel as well. Dale, I hope that this is not the last time you and I do an event together, because I've really enjoyed doing this with you. I certainly have. We certainly talked other ideas for things to do as well. So hopefully we're able to bring those to fruition. But I do want to thank everyone who stuck 32 minutes past the allotted time. I appreciate you all doing that for sure. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. I will liaise with Dale on it, and most definitely we'll hopefully do another one of these in the near future, man. So thank you all.
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
go
and
ahead.
the other thing is,
Any parting words on your side, Dale?
yeah, if anyone has additional questions, throw comments into the LinkedIn event notice for this. And we'll keep an eye on that and answer any of those questions, in depth through comments.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you all so much. And yeah, I see some comments about doing a workshop and stuff like that. Like, yeah, like, I mean, please come to me, or come to us with these. We'll be happy to make something work out of that. So that sounds awesome. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your week, and a great upcoming Labor Day weekend for those of you all who are doing that, celebrating in the United States. Appreciate y'all so much. Have a good one.